Hey everybody, if you want to grab a seat, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Chatty pals. It is lively in here. Hey friends, we want to grab a seat so we can get started? Awesome, thank you. I'm Danielle Apsorda. I'm the Community Outreach Archivist for the Cal's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. Welcome to Legacies and Lunch, Complicated Relationships, Commonwealth College, Socialism, and the American South. This monthly program is currently being held at UA Little Rock downtown. Thank you to Marta and Emily. Doubly thank you to Marta this month for also being our speaker. And this series features talks on Arkansas-related topics. If you're joining us in person today and parked in our library parking garage, be sure to stop at the table on your way out and grab a validation sticker. We also have complimentary cookies and drinks. The mural room is open today. If you do go into the mural space, do not take your cookies and drinks in there. Thank you. And also, I'd like to remind you at this time to please silence or put your phones on Do Not Disturb. And before we get started, I want to share a few announcements from the Butler Center. CALS does celebrate Earth Month, and we will be having Earth Month programming all month long, so be sure to check that out at cals.org. And this month for Second Friday Art Night, it will be on April 11th at the adjacent Cal Rocket Lab, which is right across the surface lot here. It's the triangular shaped building, and it will be from 5 to 8 p.m. Join us to chat with local artists, shop locally from Arkansas makers, listen to some music, and enjoy some wine. We will also have a knit and sip, and this month you can also learn how to do portrait art or paint a butterfly. So hope you'll join us for that. Today we're joined by Dr. Marta Cieslak. Dr. Cieslak is a historian and public historian specializing in transatlantic connections between the United States and Eastern Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her research focuses on migrations, gender, and social reform movements. She teaches courses in European, US, and gender history. She is the director of this space, UA Little Rock Downtown, where she leads research and educational projects that focus on the 1935 Joe Jones mural, The Struggle in the South, which is located in that room right there. It was originally located at Commonwealth College, that we'll hear a lot more about today. And she recently published and co-edited the volume with Anna Muller titled Gender and Nation in East Central Europe, an Uneasy History. Today's talk is about Commonwealth College, which was an experimental educational institution that for nearly 2 decades operated near Mena, Arkansas, with the explicit mission to train modern labor leaders. Though ostensibly nonsectarian, a difficult phrase to say, the college gained the reputation of being a hotbed of socialism and its sister ideologies, including communism and Marxism. But was it really? This presentation will reflect on the question of what the history of Commonwealth College can tell us about the place of socialism and in the activist traditions of the American South. If you have questions and are joining us via Zoom, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll alternate in-person and virtual questions at the end of Dr. Cieslak's talk. And I'll let her take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for this introduction, and I want to thank CALS for having me. My thanks to Danielle and Shannon and Nathan for making this possible, so thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being here. I know that the weather forecast is a little scary. I really, really appreciate you're here. Can you hear me, or do I have to do this? Yeah, no? Okay, good. As the title of my talk suggests, I'm here, as Danielle already said, to talk about Commonwealth College and socialism and the South, and you already know from the title that I consider relationships between these 3 aspects of my talk complicated. So for the sake of the argument today, I will completely ignore all the long-standing debates on where the American South starts, where it ends, what it is, and I hope that we can all agree that Arkansas is part of it. If we don't, that's fine, but let's just agree. And then, of course, I will talk about Commonwealth College, so that will come later. What might be less clear, and what I would like to address before we move on to Commonwealth, is what I mean when I use the term socialism, right? That can be a little tricky. Let me start with the precise definition of socialism. This. And of course, if you are interested in the history of socialism, you know that defining what socialism is a nearly impossible task. So let me outline a very basic framework so that at least today we know we're sort of on the same page, and you know how I will be using the term today. And I know that some of it will be very basic to many of you, but maybe not to others. So let me start with the basics. Today I will use the term socialism to refer to an economic system and economic and political philosophy that originated from the works of two German philosophers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And the most basic principles of socialism in a very simplified versions are first, advocating the social rather than private ownership of the means of production, so everything that we need to produce things. Then rejection of a free market and promotion of planned economy. And then also the proposition that economic production should be governed by the needs of society and not by the desire to accumulate profit. So a kind of most commonly discussed goal of socialists is what we refer to as redistribution of wealth, which is simply making sure that wealth is collected not in the hands of selected few, but everyone, assuming that we all participate in the production of wealth. And let me also mix in the term communism here, again, to simplify, according to Marx. Communism is the most advanced stage of socialism, so a world without private property, without government and class divisions. And that's important to keep in mind because communism is not different or separate from socialism, but rather it is sort of socialism fully and completely implemented. And now something important that again might be obvious to some of you, but maybe not so obvious to others. Socialism does not offer any coherent proposal for a political system, right? Its basis is a certain vision of economic relations and in what kind of political system these economic relations should exist has always been a matter of debate among socialist thinkers. In a common public discourse driven largely by the critics of socialism in the United States, we often hear that socialism is a threat to democracy, right? In reality, socialism is not the opposite of democracy, it's the opposite of capitalism, right? Democracy is a political system, capitalism is the economic system, and socialism as the economic system opposes capitalism. So in fact, socialists have argued that it is capitalism that destroys democracy because it leads to massive economic inequalities. And that leads me to the two final points about socialism specifically. So first, of course, the idea of conflating socialism with anti-democratic sentiments comes from the history of the Cold War and countries that self-defined as socialist or even communist, but were in fact authoritarian single-party regimes with centrally planned economies. So let me stress something that Jim Ross would say that Trotsky would not agree with me on that, but I want to say that no socialist or communist state as imagined by Marx or Engels or other socialist thinkers has ever existed anywhere in the history of the world, right? So the Soviet Union might have called itself a socialist or even communist state, but it was not. And neither were, for example, post-World War II Poland, my home country, or Czechoslovakia or East Germany, and neither are Cuba or China or Vietnam today, right? These were, and some of course still are, authoritarian single-party regimes with centrally controlled economies, although, Vietnam and China, with the deep roots in the capitalist market, I don't really know what they are. But we definitely, from the perspective of socialism as a political and economic philosophy, These countries were not and are not socialist or definitely not communist. Now, second, also may be obvious to some of you, because socialism has been one of the most popular Western philosophies ever, it has, of course, attracted many voices. And these different voices offer different takes on how socialism might or should work. So, in other words, if you ask a socialist what socialism is and how it should work, the answer will depend on their views on socialism, right? So if you studied socialism, you know that one of the greatest challenges of socialists is to actually agree with each other, right? So not a great start, but okay, so what does it all have to do with Commonwealth College? I know you came here to hear about Commonwealth College. Well, quite a lot, because as Danielle mentioned, in this project specifically, I'm interested in what Commonwealth was, and was it really as many Commonwealth contemporaries and also people today in Arkansas and beyond claim a socialist college? So let's take a look. What was Commonwealth College? If we looked for an answer in the documents and records created by people affiliated with Commonwealth, when the school existed, we would learn that Commonwealth was an experimental college that trained individuals to lead and participate in the modern labor movement. It was ostensibly, as you see in this quote here, non-sectarian and non-propaganda, and not affiliated with any religious, political, or economic dogma, which means Commonwealth officially claimed no allegiance to any political party, philosophy, or ideology. That was the official stance. The school was established in 1923 in Louisiana. It moved to Arkansas in 1924, where it began operating in early 1925, exactly a century ago. And then it closed in 1940 after 17 years of operation, over 15 of which in Arkansas. Commonwealth was a residential school. One of its unique aspects was that it aspired to function as a self-sustaining operation. So what did that mean? Education in Commonwealth was to be affordable, and to achieve that goal, and also to immerse the students and the faculty and administrative staff in the lives of the working class, everyone was required to work 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. Commonwealth ran a farm and several workshops that were designed to maintain the campus and also offer services to local communities. And the students and teachers were also required to do all the necessary domestic labor, right? So it's in a residential school, somebody has to clean, cook, and so on. And throughout the years, from 60 to 70% of the operating costs of Commonwealth were covered through this model. So a big amount, but never 100%. A typical day started at 5 a.m. when students responsible for making breakfast would get up. At 6:30, the college bell would ring, and whoever wanted breakfast needed to get up. The classes started at 7:30. No attendance was ever taken, and the students were not required to attend the classes. And I'm now realizing I'm glad to see I don't see any of my students here as I'm saying this. But of course, the assumption was that all the students that were there by their own choice and would take education seriously. And of course, the faculty were expected to make the classes interesting enough to keep the students around. The classes ended at noon, and at 1 after lunch, everyone moved to their crews or labor assignments. So again, 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, right? Everyone works. The work was over at 5 p.m., except for the kitchen crew, of course, that prepared dinner. In the evenings, the commoners participated in academic and leisure activities, such as poetry club, German or French club, dance, or theater. Theater was in fact used throughout the years of the college existence as a tool in the fight for labor rights, right? So whether through staging plays or teaching workers how to use theater to promote the labor cause, theater was a very, very important part of the curriculum. So the school self-identified as college, but it never sought accreditation, and there were really good reasons for that. For once, anyone above the age of 15 was able to apply and attend, which of course means that no secondary education was required. To be sure, the college offered a fairly typical academic curriculum, but it also addressed the needs of the students who might have been interested in more applied education. So, for example, workers active in the labor movement who actually had to take a break from organizing, right, to be in Mena, Arkansas for several months. They were encouraged to take the classes that would be actually of immediate needs for their organizing needs. Commonwealth students, they came from all over the United States, some of them from abroad, but it's important to note for our story today that throughout the 17 years, most students came from cities, and Southern workers representing whether the industrial working class or the agrarian working class were in a relatively small minority, and that affected the school to a significant extent. First, let's think about it, right? In the midst of the rural South, more students were actually interested in urban labor movement because this is where they came from, right? For example, when in the early 1930s, Clay Falk taught a class on farm problems, that was the title of the class. He usually had 2 to 3 students, while a typical class would have 15 students. And this urban-rural divide caused very telling tensions that I think can be particularly meaningful in the context of our topic today. So one student who came from rural Arkansas remembered years after the school closed that he was really annoyed with his peers eager to discuss the fate of Russian peasants and the Russian Revolution, but looking down on the Arkansas farmers. So he had to remind his colleagues, right, that while they might have had college degree, it was the Arkansas farmers who fed the people, and that was a much more practical skill than debating the fate of the Russian peasant. So what did it all mean? How does this translate into the ideological profile of the school that was Commonwealth? Historian William Cobb, who has written the only existing thus far book-length study about Commonwealth, tends to associate the ideological profile of the school with its leaders. So the college founders that you can see in the photo, William Zook, Cato Hare, and Wilbur Benton, insisted on no allegiance to any single ideology or philosophy, but the 3 of them, including Zook, who was director until 1931, from founding to 1931, self-identified as socialists in the tradition of Eugene Debs, perhaps the most well-known socialist of the era, and his profile would be today probably the closest to social democracy, definitely not any hardline Marxism. It is harder to define Zook's successor, Lucien Koch, here on the left, in any specific ideological terms. Koch was actually the product of Commonwealth. He was a student there, then instructor, and then director, starting in 1931. And like some historians characterize him as a socialist, some as a communist. What we know for sure is that he was very committed to activism in the labor movement. And he moved the school from a more academically oriented profile promoted by Zook, who was an academic, he was a professor, he had a PhD in economics, to a more kind of activism-oriented path where every commoner was required to actually participate in the labor movement. After 1935, when Koch left, there was a number of short-term leaders, and most of them didn't really leave much mark on the college, with one exception, Claude Williams, that you see here in the photo. And I would like to keep that name in mind. I will get back to Williams later in this talk. Now, let me add that I disagree with Cobb about drawing these direct links between the school leadership and its ideological profile. So of course, yes, the personal philosophies of the leaders were important because they had massive impact on how the school was structured and what was highlighted in the curriculum. But from the beginning, Commonwealth was shaken by internal conflicts that revealed that the commoners never agreed on what their school was or should be. So students, faculty, staff formed various factions, from non-denominational progressives who were sort of committed to labor movements, through Debsian socialists, all the way to the reddest communists. And those factions constantly bickered and fought over what the school should be. Also, despite this sort of aura of communal living and seeming equality, and also the fact that students were even involved in the process of administration of the school, Commonwealth was still an educational institution in rural Arkansas, and that came with very real challenges. Commonwealth very quickly gained the reputation of radical outsiders, threatening not only Polk County, like Mena, Polk County, but the American government itself. We could move. Oh yeah, here we go. Thank you. So the school's critics and enemies accused the commoners of being funded by the Soviets and plotting the overthrow of the American government. And Nathan, you're laughing, but that of course meant never-ending financial problems and a constant threat that they would be closed as the enemy of the state. And there were multiple investigations into Commonwealth, including more than one by FBI. And they all confirmed that it was highly unlikely that commoners were a threat to the American Republic. Even that didn't change the minds of those who considered the school nothing less than a Soviet agent in the middle of America. And this is to say that at all times, from the beginning until closing, the Commonwealth leadership faced the challenge of how to keep the school open, simply. Consequently, as it typically happens in situations like that, the leadership was often simply practical, and in response to that, the students were often disappointed that the school was not radical enough. And also, as is typical in situations like that, the faculty and the staff were divided and sort of, moved between different factions. So some examples of that. A recurrent sort of conflict and divisions in Commonwealth was the question of what was expected of the commoners considering the social conservatism of the local community of Polk County. The college leadership, of course, very mindful of the practical challenges of running a radical school in the middle of the rural South, repeatedly faced resistance from students and faculty who insisted that they should not have been expected to adjust to the social norms of Polk County. Among the points of contention was the tendency of Commonwealth women to take up customs and practices seen as acceptable for men only. So we have a very interesting gender dynamics here. Female commoners smoked cigarettes in public and were also wearing, you would not believe it, knickers. This is it right here. So these loose-fitting shorts. And apparently Mena residents, and I kid you not, really did not want to see the calves of women. So they complained about that. And after hearing complaints from the locals, the leadership told the women not to smoke in the public and not to wear the shorts in the public either. The women and their supporters fought back, arguing that the leadership violated their freedom of expression. And then in 1930, the rules of conduct were adopted, and let me present you some examples. So what was not tolerated at Commonwealth? Smoking in public spaces, using vulgar language, walking around shirtless, which some male students, as they were working in the fields without their shirts, public displays of affection between unmarried individuals, and my favorite, students hiking at night in gender-mixed groups without a chaperone. So hardly radical, right, from that social behavior perspective. But a much more striking source of difference among the commoners was the absence of Black faculty and students, right? So as many of you might know, the commoners did not shy away from discussing the issues of racial oppression and exploitation. Of course, the mural is a great example of that. But Commonwealth College was a segregated institution. The question of whether the college should have accepted specifically Black students emerged from the very beginning. Shortly after opening in Arkansas, a woman named Elise Chong, who was a rich Canadian, very into supporting with her fortune progressive initiatives, visited the campus and she was very impressed with it. But she was very disappointed and claimed that, quote, it was real small and mean of college management that it admitted only white students. And in response to that, the college leadership, supported by the students at that point, basically suggested that she did not know what she was talking about, that she was talking from the place of ignorance because she didn't understand the realities of the US South. In the early 1930s, the pressure to start accepting Black students came from the students. In response, the leadership presented what they considered a practical perspective, arguing that racially integrated campuses were simply illegal in Arkansas, and that Black students and faculty would be exposed to threats, right, to real dangers that rural Arkansas and specifically white Polk County posed to their safety. One student recalled that under this pressure, the college extended an invitation to a Black professor to join the faculty, and the invitation was sent together with information, quote, about the racial policy of the surrounding area. And that student recalled that the invited faculty, and this is a quote, respectfully declined the opportunity to risk his life. Right? So when in the mid of 1930s, a group of students who identified as communist once again urged the leadership to admit Black students, Director Lucien Koch responded that accepting Black students would likely just end the existence of the college, right? And this takes us back to a person I already mentioned, Claude Williams, one of the last directors of Commonwealth, whose story I think can help us understand what Commonwealth was. So Williams was a white Presbyterian minister truly committed to social justice. Sometime in the early 1930s, he became convinced that socialism was the answer to the injustices affecting Southern workers, and he joined the Socialist Party. But unlike many of his socialist colleagues, he believed that Christianity was not only compatible with socialism, but that socialism and Christianity shared the most fundamental principles. And by all accounts, Williams was especially skilled at appealing to the workers by combining the language of socialism with the language of Christianity. And why that's both unusual and very important, I would really recommend to you all the book about STFU by James Ross, who was supposed to be here but couldn't be here. But Ross talks about the importance of that religious language in the Southern labor movement. So Williams was active in the labor movement and tried to build truly interracial coalitions. So you can imagine how excited he was when the Southern Tenant Farmers Union emerged in Arkansas in 1934. And I wanted to say which town it emerged in, but I've heard like 3 different pronunciations, so I'm not gonna say, you know which, those of you who know which time, you know which time. Is it Tyronza or Toronza? Yeah, so that town. I can't remember the name, but it's James Ross, and it's his book about STFU. Thank you, Nathan.
How do you spell that name? I'll write it.
ROSS, okay. And that's our colleague from the Department of History at UA Little Rock. So STFU, as many of you might know, aims to organize Black and white sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So when Williams met the 4 white men who wrote the Union Constitution, H.L. Mitchell, Clay East, J.R. Butler, and Ward Rogers, he thought he witnessed the beginning of a socialist revolution in Arkansas and obviously was very excited about it. Now, when STFU emerged, again, 1934, and began to grow, Commonwealth seemed like its natural partner in Arkansas. That was still when Lucian Cope was Commonwealth's director, and the two organizations began organizing together and collaborating. So, for example, STFU funded scholarships for young farmers to attend Commonwealth, and Commonwealth students and faculty supported STFU organizing events and labor protests. Also, Commonwealth offered field classes for sharecroppers and tenant farmers who were unable to attend Commonwealth, and that included Black farmers, right? They were not literally allowed on campus, right? So Commonwealth instructors would go to them. However, from the very beginning of that partnership, STFU leaders who, these are not conservatives, right? We need to think about that. Were cautious of Commonwealth's reputation as a potential hotbed of communism, specifically communism. That's important for us today. And let's keep that in mind as we move on. So in the summer of 1935, exactly when the mural was created, by the way, Claude Williams, not yet director of Commonwealth, opened the New Era School for Social Action and Prophetic Religion here in Little Rock. The first cohort of the students included 10 Black and 9 white students and embodied the so-called Popular Front, or a coalition of communist, socialist, liberal, and progressive activists that came together to fight against fascism, right? This is the 1930s. That belief in interracial alliances took Williams not only to STFU, but also to the Communist Party, which was at the time one political force in the United States dominated by white Americans that also included support for the Black civil rights struggles in its program. Possibly the only political party with that explicitly in the program. So as of 1936, Williams was a member of both the Socialist and Communist parties. And what's important for us today is that was extremely unusual, because this is a good place to know that the leftist movement in the US in the 1930s was really conflicted, marked by internal divisions, and that included hostilities between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, both at the national and state levels, and also between these parties and labor unions, and that doesn't even include the conflicts within all these organizations. So here we are in 1937. Commonwealth is working with STFU to support the Southern labor. STFU leaders are working with Commonwealth, but still quite concerned about its reputation as a communist school. And Claude Williams, who is a Popular Front believer, so that coalition of all progressives against fascism, also a member of both socialist and communist parties, and devoted Christian, becomes Commonwealth's director with the blessing of the STFU Executive Council, although without the blessing of two key STFU leaders, H.L. Mitchell and Howard Kester, who are particularly concerned about Williams and his potential connections to communism. Williams also gets the STFU approval for his plan for Commonwealth, and this plan claims, quote, that Commonwealth should become an integral part of labor's educational program in the South, and that it should focus its effort on helping educate and organize specifically Black and white Southern workers. And this is really important and interesting because it's the first time in the history of Commonwealth when that school is formally, through an agenda, right, through a plan, imagined as an organization specifically in service of the Southern labor movement. Now, STFU leadership still very clearly uncomfortable with Commonwealth's reputation as a potentially communist school. Because of that, Williams claims he dropped his Communist Party membership. Some historians don't believe him, but that's what he claims. Williams joins the STFU Executive Council. The STFU president, J.R. Butler, becomes an instructor in Commonwealth. Everything is great, right? Because in 1937, right, when Williams becomes the president of Commonwealth, it appears that the school is finally moving into the direction it has always neglected. And that is to work predominantly with and for the Southern labor. Williams also promises to eradicate internal sectarian conflicts. And, everything is going really, really well. No, it's not. Cliffhanger. Summer 1938. A really, really strange story. I will keep it very short. Claude Williams visits the home of J.R. Butler, the president of STFU. They're both friends and collaborators. This is just a friendly visit. For some reason, this is August in Arkansas. For some reason, Williams apparently is wearing a coat, but he's hot, right? August in Arkansas. So he takes off his coat and then he forgets it, right? He leaves Butler's home, he forgets his coat, and to cut a very long story short, it turns out that there are some papers in the packet of that coat. And Butler takes a look at the papers and he cannot believe his own eyes. The papers, really the document, is an outline of a plan for Commonwealth to take over the STFU with the help of the Communist Party. So according to the document, Commonwealth would need $500 from the center to implement the plan of, quote, establishing a real party base in the STFU and to capture the Union for our line at the next convention. So, yeah, exactly. The papers, in short, suggest that Williams and Commonwealth are working with the communists to take over the STFU, with the National Party, right, of communists. Butler is furious. He immediately shares the document with his STFU colleagues. Williams claims that this is just one big misunderstanding, but the STFU leadership feel that their fears have been confirmed, right? So they break their relationship with Commonwealth and Williams. The school, needs to redefine itself. It never really recovers from that earthquake. Williams leaves Commonwealth in 1939, and only a year later, the school is closed after the last desperate attempts to keep the college financially afloat. So what does it tell us about Commonwealth? Now, there's no doubt that the principles associated with socialism, as I very vaguely outlined at the beginning of this talk, were always at the foundations of the school. So in that sense, Commonwealth was a socialist college, but I would argue that this is a very imprecise way to describe it. Defining Commonwealth as a socialist college, I would argue, contributes to the existing confusion over what socialism is and also explains very little about Commonwealth. So instead, I would like to suggest that maybe if we wanted to think of Commonwealth in more precise terms, we could try to think of its history not in the regional context, but in the national context, as a reflection of the larger history of the leftist movement in the United States. In other words, Commonwealth is not as unusual or kind of strange in Arkansas as it seems. It seems to be mirroring certain issues and trends that exist at the national level. So throughout the 17 years of the college existence, over 15 of which in Arkansas, repeated internal conflicts and tensions, some of which almost destroyed the school, were driven by ideological differences. So people who self-defined as socialists, communists, social democrats, progressives, or simply labor organizers argue in Commonwealth and with Commonwealth, right, like STFU folks, and they were not able to reach a consensus, or perhaps most importantly, find a way to organize above ideological differences. Like the larger leftist labor-oriented anti-capitalist movement in the US, different factions of the commoners never figured out a common agenda. And of course, one thing I want to mention, the other part of this story that I don't have time to discuss today, is, of course, that the college existed in an incredibly hostile environment, right? Whether Polk County, or Arkansas, or the US, opposition to pro-labor principles rooted in socialism, of course, have been really real in the United States and had huge impact on school. I don't want to diminish the importance of this. This is sort of the other side of that coin, of that story that I just don't discuss today, not to take 2 hours of your life. So, what's more, the most commoners did not really seem to understand the South or the Southern workers. And that was not necessarily because they didn't care. Again, most of them came from cities from outside of the South, mostly Midwest and Northeast. They were coming to Arkansas not to help the Southern worker, but to study labor issues, learn the organizing skills, and return to their homes to implement those skills, right? And the spatial isolation of the Commonwealth campus in rural Arkansas really allowed the commoners to sort of function in a bubble, where, as an example I noted earlier, suggests they could be more concerned with the fate of the Russian peasant than the fate of the Southern tenant farmer or sharecropper. But here, of course, I need to stress that there was a number of commoners that were always involved in the Southern labor movement, or came out of the Southern labor movement. It was just always a small minority. And it is telling that Commonwealth started literally falling apart at the time when it seemed most committed to the Southern labor, or when it seemed closest to understanding the issues central to the fate of the Southern workers. Whether Williams' alleged master plan, including the communist takeover of the STFU, was real or not, it is clear that under Williams' leadership, Commonwealth aspired to be a truly Southern school, and that meant a truly radical school. One whose leadership and faculty and students recognized that they needed to face the specific challenges of rural interracial organizing in places where this kind of work provoked not only hostilities, but it could literally pose a threat to one's life or well-being. Finally, the story of Commonwealth I want to suggest today, and this is very much work in progress, is a case study of deeply rooted problems that turned the American leftist movement of the 1930s into really fragmented mess and a political liability. Now, the STFU leaders, who, by the way, had their own major flaws. I'm not going to go into it. That's a different story. But they had really good reasons to fear the communist takeover of their union, and there were many reasons for that. But perhaps most importantly, because some American communists did, in fact, take directions directly from the Comintern. And that association with the center of the Soviet power in the midst of Stalin's purges, right? This is the 1930s, could not have helped the general leftist cause in the US, and could not have helped people like Claude Williams. So while I currently lean towards believing that Williams appeared genuine in his lifelong conviction to support the working class, he continued that work all the way into the 1970s when he passed. We don't know as of now. These archival documents are actually being released as we speak. We don't know as of now whether he was among those affiliated with the Soviets, although we have some evidence that suggests quite compellingly that he at least took money from the people who were directly affiliated with Joseph Stalin. From American communists. What we know for sure is that Commonwealth ended up becoming a microcosm of a larger radical leftist movement in the United States in the 1930s. What does it mean? It offered a truly badly needed alternative to the ongoing oppression and exploitation of the working class, but it also collapsed under the pressure of messy conflicts and factional power games that too often turned out to be more important than the labor movement or the fate of the American work. Thank you. Any questions?
me see if I can find. Do you have that second mic?
We do, and I work here, so I don't bring it.
Hello. Okay, great. We'll take an in-person question first, and then we'll take one from the online chat if people want to put questions in there. Any in-person? Okay.
Super interesting. Question I have is, so you said at the beginning the school was sort of self-consciously non-sectarian, but did it think of itself as being a part of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO? And part of the reason why I asked that is what's interesting also is to think about how a lot of the tensions, especially of like the out-of-state northern international students adjusting to the South, the cultural mores of the South, seems to prefigure a lot of the tensions that would happen in the 40s with Operation Dixie and the CIO's attempt to organize factories in the South, and even maybe the civil rights movement with like Freedom Summer and some of the tensions between northern liberals and people in the South then as well.
Thank you for this question. And the way you phrase the question is exactly how we would think about it, but I think it also provides some answers, which is, did the school think of itself as, right? And one of the problems with Commonwealth is that there doesn't seem to be such a thing as the Commonwealth way of thinking, right? So to answer your question, in terms of like an official agenda or plan, no. They had a very complicated relationship with labor unions generally, with which is ironic, right? With organizing generally. I'm not going to go into details, but by the end of its existence, they're kind of trying to figure out whether they should be explicitly affiliated with any major, labor union or organizations, but no. And it is an interesting reflection of that messy relationship with the labor movement. Again, this is a school that claims to train future labor leaders, right? But they kind of don't know what to do with that.
Other in person?
I don't think you really need that from me.
Well, it's more for people on Zoom. Yeah.
Who are the people who originally made this thing?
Yeah. Well, they are these people here, right? So they are very highly educated, very urban, academically oriented socialists, active in the National Socialist movement. Kate O'Hare was one of the major figures with her husband of the socialist movement in the United States, right? But these are the same people who fund Commonwealth and who insist that their own political views, their own activism, their own history in the movement should not have any impact on how the school is run. And to some extent, it's true. They accepted many students that would have disagreed with them on many issues, particularly students on the left of them, communists. But it's a difficult question for me because William Cobb, in the book I mentioned, The Radical Education in the South, he would have a very precise answer to you how their views really translated into what Commonwealth was. I tend to disagree with that. I think that the students and faculty who presented different political factions had more impact on the school that Cobb suggests. Does that answer your question? Not really.
They're basically activists. What has rural Louisiana got to do with it?
Oh, why? So
It's a thing.
is your question why they're here? Why they're coming to Arkansas, first Louisiana and then Arkansas? I mean, there are two answers to this question. There's official one, and there is one that historians sort of try to ponder. So what they're imagining, right, is a commune. And they claim in the archival documents that the reason why they come to the South, it's because it's cheaper. They can buy land and then they can create this campus, right? I can't. Like they literally build a campus, right, with multiple buildings in the middle of nowhere. And they want to be self-sustaining. So financial concerns are very real. Somehow this is right here, right? So you see the photo right on top here. This is the campus of Commonwealth College, right? And they claim they came to Mena because the land was cheap and there was enough to buy it, right? And then the assumption was this is a universal message. It will spread, across the country and across the world, right? So that's their official answer. But I had a very interesting conversation with Bobby Roberts about this, right? And Bobby Roberts suggested to me something that I keep thinking about, and I think he might be onto something. And that is, of course, Mena, Arkansas is relatively close to mining labor activism, right, that had happened before the school comes to Mena, Arkansas. So this is not an area that is somehow awfully disconnected from the labor movement or labor protests. They're very close from Sebastian County, right, from the mining labor activism in Arkansas, right? So yeah, on the one hand, they're in the middle of nowhere, but also they are in the area where labor activism had been historically very present.
Other questions? Yeah.
Is there anything left of that campus?
That's a fantastic question. We often get this. So this is a private property now. There was some sort of like a horse breeding operation there for years. And we know that the current owners and the owners before them do not really appreciate people sort of snooping around and trying to learn what's going on. We've heard, we haven't been there, right? It's a private property, but we had visitors from Mena, and there are, legends, right? Some people claim there are still some buildings standing, others claim that there's really nothing. We had a very interesting encounter with someone from Chicago who is active in the labor movement, and that person was doing their own tour around these, labor history places, and they went there and they tried just like take photos, and they ended up being like, thrown on the hood of their car by the police. So yeah, it's a very interesting question, much more revealing much deeper meaning that you might even think.
We have one question from the online chat from Alyssa. They ask, you mentioned the need for chaperones in some nighttime activities. Were there ever any other rules that maintain curfews or chaperone presence?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I listed some of the rules from the rules of conduct was that from the perspective of the social expectations, the schools was pretty, I don't want to say conservative, it's such a strange word, right? But the commoners were incredibly aware of their own place in the community. And one thing I didn't touch upon in this presentation is that initially the community really welcomed them, right? So Mena, Polk County, we have a lot of evidence suggesting that the local folks were sort of considering commoners like the weirdos from the city, they're kind of strange, but the Commonwealth people put a lot of effort into bringing them to campus, right? So they could use the services of the campus. They work with them on the farm. We know that Commonwealth had some medical services like a nurse that the locals very much appreciated. There was no medical service in the local area. And then, with the anti-socialist or anti-Commonwealth campaign that started, that trust increasingly was, sort of started disappearing. And by the mid 1930s, with a huge contribution from the local preacher who was incredibly focused on the idea of destroying Commonwealth, Polk County residents sort of started considering Commonwealth the enemy, right? But I'm mentioning it because, the question was about all these rules. There were rules all over the place. Like, one I didn't mention was that the dorms were gender specific, with the exception of married couples. They could live together, and there was, if I remember correctly, like if young men and young women wanted to meet in the evening on the weekend, there must have been the chaperone was required. Whether, we know that some of them did not believe it, but they wanted to, at least the leadership wanted to respect the place that they were a part of.
Do we have any more in-person questions? Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned about communes. Was there, like, after Commonwealth closed, was there any like communal societies or any communes that erupted after the college closed or anything like that? I know like Sulphur Springs up in West Arkansas was a commune. Was there anything like that happened afterwards?
Yeah, James, this is a really interesting question. To be honest with you, I don't know that history of communes in the 1940s. What we know is that, of course, Commonwealth is not the only school of that kind in the United States. Based only on the numbers of enrollment, it was one of the largest. Some of them, Highlander School, existed much longer than Commonwealth. There was even some plan to kind of move Commonwealth into Highlander. But we also need to keep in mind that the 1940s, right, the world is a different place, right? Once the United States joins World War II, there is a completely dramatic, huge change in considering the priorities, right? And the 30s, the 30s really is the golden era of the leftist movement. It's just getting less and less popular, including those communal projects. But I don't think they ever disappeared, right? They exist until today. Yeah.
We probably have time for about one more question. Does anyone in the audience have another one? All right, then I guess we will thank Dr. Cieslak for.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just in closing, I want to thank you so much for joining us today at Legacies and Lunch. If you want to support programs like this, please consider donating to the Butler Center at robertslibrary.org. You can join us here at UA Little Rock downtown next month on Wednesday, May 7th for Dr. Kane West from the National Park Service, who will be presenting Hot Springs and the Birth of the National Park Service. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again.
Thank you.